Tian, Mawei slope. The bright emperor wheeled his horse to ride away, the young consort dead. Their love was unforgettable, but time passes and renews. After all, it was the wise, the imperial thing to do. Better than that other emperor who saved his concubines but lost his kingdom. So we continue with a few more heptasyllabic poems from the late Tang Dynasty, and this is the first and only entry in this anthology by Zheng Tian. Zheng Tian is quite an interesting figure, and he has quite an extensive biography in the back of this volume. So let me read it for you. So Zheng Tian was born in 825, a native of Xinjiang. In 842, he passed both the Jinshi examination and the more difficult preeminent talent examination as well. He served as a judge on a regional military commission, later was appointed district defender at Weinan, and auxiliary in the historiography office. Before long, his father, who was an influential member of the Li faction, was demoted to Guizhong. His son went with him, and he later served in various non-official posts in the Taijuan area. In 864, he was called to court as a bureau vice director in the Ministry of Justice. Within 5 years, he had risen to be a Hamlin academician, recipient of edicts, bureau director in the Ministry of Revenue, participant in the drafting of proclamations. He mainly served under Emperor Xuanzong, and under him, he was promoted to some important posts, including right policy advisor in the Secretariat Chancellery, and in 875, Vice Minister of War and Ground Councillor. That year was a very infamous one, 875, for the Tang Dynasty, because it was the year that the Huang Chao rebellion began. For the next 5 years, debate raged at court about the best way to deal with the rebels. In 876, Zheng Tian was sent to the field as regional military commissioner at Fengxiang, and because of his success against the rebels, he was appointed Ground Councillor in 877. He was a strong opponent of Gao Pian in the court debates about how to defeat the rebels, and in the following year he was dismissed. In 880, after writing a memorial to Emperor Xuanzong with his own blood, he was reappointed a Ground Councillor and commander of the Joint Expeditionary Force, and his forces had some successes against Huang Chao. In 881, he was again relieved from his command and returned to Chengdu, where the Xizong Emperor had fled when Huang Chao had captured Chang'an, the capital, the previous year. After a year of acting as Vice Director of the Department of State Affairs, he received the largely ceremonial post of Grand Guardian of the Heir Apparent. He died in 883. 16 poems of his have survived, of which this is the most famous, the best-known Tang quatrain on the death of Jiang Guifei. So as you can see, quite a big biography. So Zheng Tian was an important scholar official in the last days of decline of the Tang Dynasty. In fact, the emperor he served, Tang Xuanzong, is the last one who really had any semblance of real power. And as you have heard from the biography, it was during Xuanzong's reign and Zheng Tian's tenure that the Huang Chao rebellion broke out. It was a massive rebellion that completely devastated China, especially the south, but all of it, and the capital was sacked by the rebels, and the emperor, just as his ancestor Tang Xuanzong, had to run away and take refuge in Shu while his capital was overtaken. So dark time in the empire, the end, the last years, the last decades of the empire. And the poem that we have is a pretty short poem. It touches on a topic we've encountered a lot of times before, notably in Bai Juji's The Song of Everlasting Sorrow, which is the death of Jiang Guifei, concubine of the bright emperor Tang Xuanzong. Now, when we talked about those poems, we already mentioned some things which I'm going to repeat now, which is that Chinese history had a very traditionalist, misogynistic point of view. It was this idea that women were very dangerous for rulers. And it's basically the concept of the kingdom toppling beauty, which already appears in, I think, some of the poems of the Xi Jing. It's the idea that, a good ruler has to be centered in administering and worrying himself for his citizens, but there's always the temptation to indulge in pleasure and to be besotted by women. And there are a series of exempla from remote antiquity to the present in Chinese history, especially in the history of the imperial period, that always quoted these examples of seductive, alluring women that distracted the emperor from rulership and actually provoked dynastic fall. In the case of Tang Xuanzong, we know that this fall was more of a toppling. That is to say, the reign of Tang Xuanzong, especially the first, let's say, 30, 40 years, which are generally known as the Kaijuan era, are probably the zenith of Tang power. But after those years came the Tianbao period, in the middle of that one, the Anushan Rebellion. And as you know the story that is told in this poem, because we've told it in previous poems, the emperor had to run away. At the Mawei slope, his own soldiers mutinied and demanded the execution of the members of the Yang clan, including Zheng Guifei. The emperor had to acquiesce in this murder. And then he continued into Shu, where he remained for a time, while his main son and heir, Xuanzong, proclaimed himself emperor in the northwest, in Fengxiang, and managed to muster troops and to recover the capital. And afterwards, Xuanzong was more or less forced to abdicate and adopt the position of retired emperor while his son ruled for the remainder of his life. So this poem, Mawei Slope, the topic of the poem is that famous incident which would be recreated in poetry of the Tang and of following successive dynasties, and also of different dramas. But because of its character, you can see that it's very different from Bai Juji's take, which would be the more melodramatic and conventional. This is a very short poem, it's a quatrain. It actually doesn't delve too much on the incident itself. It delves more into the political lessons that can be taken. So we could say that the poem is a historical poem evoking Zhang Guifei's death. But also there's a very clear, like in many historical poems, there's a very clear political message, like this is the right thing to do. And taking into account Zheng Tian's background, I wonder if he is not, in a way, carving a lesson for his own Emperor Xuanzong, who, like his ancestors, we said before, had to run away into Shu when his capital was sacked by the enemies. And maybe there's this criticism, you've indulged in pleasure and decadence, and that's bad, but well, all is not lost yet. We might still save the kingdom. So let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet as usual. First couplet. The bright emperor wheeled his horse to ride away, the young consort dead. Their love was unforgettable, but time passes and renews. So the poem presents us at the end of the famous incident, that is post-Rem. So already has Jiang Guifei been murdered. The emperor is turning his horse and moving forward towards Shu. Bright Emperor Ming Huang is another of the names, one of the nicknames that is used for Tang Xuanzong. And so the event has already happened. The poem does not center its pathos in a pathetic description of the suffering or the pain of the emperor while witnessing his concubine's execution. It moves forward. And the second line pushes us also forward. It says, their love was unforgettable. It became the stuff of legend. But time passes and renews. We have to accept things and we have to move on. And the second couplet actually, explains why one should move on from this. If it were not obvious, it makes a lesson on statecraft and good rulership. And it says, after all, it was the wise, the imperial thing to do. Better than that other emperor who saved his concubines but lost his kingdom. Now, this is a reference to the last ruler of the Chen dynasty, Chen Shupao, who, like many last rulers of dynasties, became the epitome of the corrupt last bad ruler, and who had a reputation of having lost his kingdom because he just delved into pleasure, poetry, dancing, sex, and the pleasures of the flesh in general. So the Chen dynasty was the last of the southern kingdoms to fall to the Shui when they unified the country, and allegedly Emperor Chen Shupao hid when his capital walls were breached. He allegedly hid in a well in his palace with his concubines, from where he was taken out by the troops of the victorious Shui dynasty. So he saved his life he saved the life of his concubines, but he lost his throne. He was definitely to be considered an epitome of a corrupt, bad monarch. So here, what Zheng Tian is saying is that Xuanzong wasn't that bad. He at least recognized in the direst hour of need that it was better to sacrifice one's affections, one's deeply held affections, one's love, because of duty and service. And it was better to sacrifice the concubine than to lose the kingdom. Which I suppose, again, I don't know when this poem was written, but I imagine it could be a piece of good advice for Emperor Xuanzong when he lost his capital, which is, center yourself on governing. You might still recover the capital and save the nation. And it does ring a little bit hollow, and there's an irony also in the image, because Emperor Xuanzong did not really preserve his kingdom. I mean, as I told you before, he was actually forced to abdicate by his son, 1 year or so after the start of the rebellion. He was able to preserve his position as retired emperor and living in the palace and so on, but in a way, he lost his throne, although you could argue perhaps that what was saved was the dynasty, not the individual. And that would have been, again, also a powerful lesson that Zheng Tian would probably have wanted to push forward to his own emperor at a time when the dynasty was effectively collapsing.